Friends, this morning I shall talk to you about contemporary Indian English fiction. But in order to do that, one needs to contextualize a bit. And so I shall go back in time to virtually the middle of the 19th century, when important developments in the cultural context came about. One of them was, of course, the idea of India as a nation. Before the British came here, there must have been a very loose sense of nationhood, and we do speak about the geographical unity of our land from Kanyakumari to the Himalayas, and from Kandahar in Afghanistan to Kamboja, which is Cambodia, a cultural unity. But if you want to think in terms of a modern nation state, perhaps we need to go back to the context of colonialism. And I think to some extent, British rule brought about a sense of nationhood amongst us. The way in which they connected various parts of our country through the railroad, the post and telegraphic systems which they put in place, the ornithological and geological surveys they conducted, the ethnographic researches they conducted, much of this created a body of knowledge which gave us a sense of being part of a larger whole. The impact of this is also felt in literature. Because literature is a barometer of culture. And when it comes to the business of prose narrative, you will find that some of the early stirrings in India, where they began writing in English, get linked up with the introduction into India of English education. English education, of course, has had an earlier history. I think in the late decades of the 18th century, there were some efforts to create conditions in India where English education could be introduced. But perhaps the landmark decision was 1817, when this famous college called Hindu College was set up in Calcutta. Today, Hindu College is called Presidency College. But that is where people like Raja Ram Mohan Roy and others had their activities. A major thinker in Hindu College at that time was a man called Desrosiers, whose poetry is something we will be talking about in another lecture. But these conditions which were created in Hindu College were, I think, part of the larger enterprise of making India a modern nation. And they saw that modernity was in some ways deeply linked up with English education. In 1835, as you know, Lord Macaulay, in his very famous Minute on Indian education, cast a decisive vote in the great debate which was taking place at that time between the Anglicists, the Orientalists, and the Vernacularists. There were three groups: the Anglicists rooting for English education, the Orientalists saying it's more important for Indians to know Sanskrit and Persian, the classical languages, and the Vernacularists saying not the classical languages, not English, but modern languages, or languages which are spoken by the people like Telugu or Hindi or Bengali. So in this debate, the great moment came when Lord Macaulay had to cast a vote, and his vote was decisively in favor of English education. So this was the beginning, in some sense, of English as a medium of instruction in our country, and we have not recovered from that historical intervention even today. I'm saying recovered because there have been good things and bad things about the introduction of English education in India. One of the good things, of course, was that many Indians who were already writing in English began to get greater inspiration to compose in the English language. And you see this both in poetry and in fiction. I am now concentrating on the fiction. If you look at the earliest stirrings, I think you'll have to go to Bankim Chandra, the great Bengali thinker, intellectual and novelist. Of course, he wrote a good deal in Bangla, but his first effort at writing a novel was in English, and that appeared in the 1860s, a book called Raj Mohan's Wife. It was an effort at some kind of a romantic tale of intrigue between members of a family, a kind of an effort at describing life in rural Bengal, but it was also a highly moral effort at showing the victory of good over evil. The other important figure in this business of writing novels is, of course, Tagore. We now have a good deal of Tagore's work translated into English, but we must not forget that Tagore brought in a kind of a modern spirit into cultural activity by writing in Bengali, but using the novel as his form. And one of the greatest novels which Tagore wrote was Gora. Gora is a novel which in a way dramatizes the conflicts of 19th century Calcutta in particular, Bengal in general, maybe India in a greater generality. But it's all about the Brahmo Samaj and the modern rational way of looking at religion. It's about caste, it is about gender, it is about race, and a whole range of issues which we now consider very modern issues were anticipated by Tagore in that very wonderful novel. So anyone who wants to understand modern India, in my opinion, should read Tagore's Gora. But Gora was written in Bengali. We have a translated version in English. What I'm trying to say, of course, is that the idea of writing fiction, the idea of writing a novel, is something which we can more or less trace to the mid-19th century, and it is linked up with questions of modernity, with questions of nationhood, with questions of identity. That is why Meenakshi Mukherjee, in her very well-known book, not the Twice-Born Fiction, which of course was her first novel, but the second one, called Realism and Reality, she makes a distinction between Purana and Nutana. Purana, as we can understand, is old. Of course, it also refers to the great Pauranic tradition of narration in India, where the gods and goddesses were mythologized, and we have all kinds of fantastic events taking place, but with a great deal of philosophical and allegorical meaning embedded in those narratives. But the Pauranic way of narration is usually linked up with some sense of a timeless world, a metaphysical world. So ordinary reality of the kind which you and I experience, the relativistic world of ordinary life, is not the focus of the Pauranic narrative. There, time is not real time. It is not clock time, but it is mythical time, or mythological time, or transcendental time, or eternal time, if you like, or timeless time. Okay? So that kind of a large perspective which you see in the Pauranic narrative is a very important strain in the Indian consciousness. I'll be coming back to this point a little later. But Meenakshi Mukherjee's distinction between the Purana and the Nutana is what I am now focusing on. Nutana means new, that which is new. And you know that the novel, when we say novel, in the English context, the novel rose in the 18th century. It had something to do with the rise of the middle classes in England. It had something to do with capitalism and colonialism. Defoe's great book, Robinson Crusoe, is a classic example of the modern novel, and the first English novel, in fact, which seems to embody within itself the tensions of bourgeois society of the time. So the novel is linked up with a new world view. And in the 19th century, India's middle class was also increasing in size. It became a very important part of the national culture. If you wanted to see any kind of movement in Indian thought or any kind of progress in the Indian consciousness, you would have to necessarily look at the great middle class of India, which was then rising into its own stature. The national movement, for example, was basically a middle class movement. We mustn't forget that. The great thinkers were all middle class people who had their own middle class values, and they saw nationhood as an important end for achieving the purposes of the middle classes. And the novel, to some extent, is implicated in this cultural and political movement. So I'm moving on. It's going to be a brief survey, and I cannot possibly deal with every writer or every text, but I will try and highlight some of the important developments in the rise of the Indian English novel and the development of that novel up to our own times. I'll move on now from Bankim and Tagore and move on to other writers who began writing in the south of India particularly. There's Rajamayar, who wrote a lot in Tamil, but also wrote one or two well-known novels in English. Vasudeva Shastri, for example, is a novel which he wrote, and it is a Vedantic novel. In fact, it's a novel about Vedanta, and it's an effort at promoting Vedantic ways of living. The whole idea of detachment and detached action, which we are familiar with from the Bhagavad Gita, is embodied in this novel by Rajamayar. Then we have Madhavaya. Madhavaya is again a man who wrote a good deal in English, but he also wrote in Tamil. The point I'm making, of course, is that some of our best writers, and we've seen this in Bankim, in the early part of our story, are bilingual. They write both in their mother tongue or in the language of the area, and they also write in English. And so this raises an interesting issue which we have not been able to completely get rid of. Even today we ask the same question. Why should an Indian write in English? And if an Indian writes in English, is his or her creative effort going to be authentic? Can English embody the authentic reality of India? Or is writing in English automatically a compromise, where you're trying to put an Indian idea into a form which has been derived from some other part of the world? This question keeps coming up, and it's been answered by different writers in different ways. And I'll try and give you a sense of that as we go along. Mahatma Gandhi is dominating the scene in India. He, of course, as you know, came back from South Africa after experimenting with Satyagraha in 1915. And by 1920, he had effectively taken over the national movement from other important figures like Gokhale, who of course died in around 1915, and Tilak, who I think died in 1920. So these great thinkers were all very important for Mahatma Gandhi, but Gandhi managed to strike a balance between Gokhale's constitutionalism and Tilak's extremism, and he derived inspiration from both and created a movement of what we call non-violent, non-cooperation, satyagraha, ahimsa, satya, and so on, and galvanized the Indian public. So today, I think most of us, whatever may be our ideological predilections, are unlikely to deny the fact that if India won freedom in 1947, to a large extent, to a large measure, that credit must go to Mahatma Gandhi because of his very unique way of tackling the British. Now this naturally had an impact on literature, and you'll find that the three great English writers in India, R.K. Narayan, Raja Rao, Mulk Raj Anand, they are the trinity, okay? And you can see that these three people were all profoundly influenced by Gandhi. Let me take you to Mulk Raj Anand. In the first novel which he wrote called Untouchable, you must know that Untouchable was written in about 20 or 25 days in the Sabarmati ashram where Gandhi was camping. And Mulkraj Anand, who had come back from England, sat at Gandhi's feet and wrote this novel and even showed it to Gandhi for approval. And I think Gandhi made a few suggestions. So it is clearly a Gandhian book because of that proximity. But it's also Gandhian in another way, because there are three solutions which Baka is given to get away from this untouchability, from this caste context, and from the exploitation which he experiences in that one day in his life. But the Gandhian idea is there as one of the possible solutions in that book. That is why it's a Gandhian book. Now move on to Raja Rao. When you think of this, the first novel which he wrote in the 1930s called Kantapura, you find that there is a Pauranic narrative technique being employed by Raja Rao. That is the interesting point, that even though the novel is linked up with realism, with reality, and with the progress of history, when it comes to the Indian writers, they cannot give up their old Pauranic habits of thought. And Raja Rao in Kantapura actually gives you a narration which is almost a breathless narration, almost like an evening's kalakshepam, the discourse, the religious discourses, upanyasas which are given in many parts of India, where for 3-4 hours the speaker dances and sings and narrates the mythological stories. You have that atmosphere of the Pauranic narrative in Kantapura. But it is a Gandhian book because it's all about a small village called Kantapura, where there's a man called Murthy, who is a very Gandhian figure and who tries to help the people, and there is a great deal of conflict between Murthy and other people in the village who feel that Gandhi and Gandhian attitudes are destroying the caste structure of society. There's also conflict between Murthy and the British, and there's a whole beautiful allegory which develops in this novel. When you come to R.K. Narayan, you'll find that Narayan, through his writings, even though he doesn't seem to be talking about Gandhi all the time, except in one novel which he wrote in 1956 called Waiting for the Mahatma, in all his novels you find that the Gandhian attitude of self-abnegation, of truthful behavior, of ethical conduct, of the means being as pure as the ends, these are ideas which constantly keep coming up in R.K. Narayan's fiction. Take, for example, Jagan in the vendor of sweets. Jagan is a man who makes his money and he has a double account in a typical Marwadi way of doing two accounts. And he rationalizes by saying that nowhere in Mahatma Gandhi's teachings did he say we should not have two accounts. All right? But when it comes to his food, when it comes to his dress, when it comes to the kind of slippers he wears, he is very strictly an adherent of the Mahatma. But he has difficulty with his son, who comes down from America with a woman whom he seems to have married but apparently has not married, and then he wants to set up a novel writing machine and all kinds of funny ideas, and Jagan has difficulty negotiating with his son and daughter-in-law. But he realizes that his daughter-in-law, even though she is an American, is not a bad sort, so he manages to get a ticket for her to send her back to America, and then he makes space with his son. And throughout his fiction you'll find these Gandhian reverberations coming again and again and again. That's why I would consider these three great writers, whom we call the trinity of Indian fiction in English, as fundamentally Gandhian novelists. There are other Gandhian novelists who are very clearly part of a Gandhian worldview, like Venkatramani, who wrote Kandan the Patriot and Murugan the Tiller. These are all books about the Gandhian revolution. Then you have K.A. Abbas, who of course has had Marxist sympathies, but he's also got a Gandhian dimension to him. We have K.S. Nagarajan, who in the Chronicles of Kedaram also seems to have a Gandhian dimension in his writings. If you look at the developments in Indian English fiction a little later. If you look at the 50s and the 60s, particularly the 60s, you'll find that there are big changes taking place in India at that time. The optimism of the 50s has given way to a certain pessimism in the 60s. And it's also something to do with the larger worldview, you know, the Vietnam War, civil rights movement in America, India not exactly developing in the way in which Nehru thought it might develop, the Chinese war against India, the Pakistani war with India, all these things developed kind of created a sense of insecurity in the Indian mind. So novelists at this time, and I'm thinking particularly of Anita Desai and Arun Joshi, these are writers who, instead of looking outward at the social scene and trying to give you a satirical account of what's going on, as R.K. Narayan does, for example, or Nagarajan in Chronicles Kedaram does, for example, they move inwards. They become self-reflexive. They become psychologically intense. And so in much of Anita Desai's fiction, you're likely to find a deep psychological analysis of what it means to be in an age of transition. A modern nation, but caught in the throes of an older worldview. That is, of course, the real problem in India, isn't it? Even today, we are struggling with the idea of modernity, but we are not able to give up our values which are coming down from the tradition. And we need to negotiate these things and come up with some kind of a balance. Going this way or that way is not correct. We cannot go regressively into the past. At the same time, we cannot mindlessly move into the future without some roots. And we need to have some kind of a balance in these matters. There are other novelists also, people like Manohar Malgaonkar. He wrote a book called The Princes, in which he takes you through the throes of princely India and the manner in which the princes had to finally accept the Congress and modern India's independence. Remember, the princes, many of them resisted integration into India. Khushwant Singh writes about the partition in Train to Pakistan. And of course, he's a first-rate satirist. He writes with malice to everybody, as you know, in his little short vignettes in the newspapers. He's written a huge number of short stories and 3 or 4 novels. But in all these novels and his short stories, there is a kind of earthy humor and a satirical bent of mind which allows him to see things in perspective, to make fun of all the great sacred cows of this country, and then to arrive at his own understanding of events and people and matters. During the emergency, he supported the emergency. And many people got very upset with him for having done that. But in 1984, when there was the terrible anti-Sikh riots in Delhi after Indira Gandhi's death, he returned his medals and his honors to the government as a mark of protest against Operation Blue Star, which was actually letting the army go into the Golden Temple in Amritsar. Wonderful writer. But I'm now cutting the story short, a long story short. 1980, great year. Okay, that is the year when Salman Rushdie publishes a book called Midnight's Children. I still remember reading this novel, not in India. I happened to be in England at that time, and I had myself faced a certain degree of racial abuse in the year I was in England. And when I read this book, I suddenly felt proud of the fact that an Indian could write a novel like this, using the English language in order to turn the tables on the Englishmen themselves, not giving them any quarter whatsoever. You know, many Indian writers in English would use Indian words, like Raja Rao, for example, and then give you a glossary at the end of the book. Okay, a word like karma, what is dharma, and so on. But Salman Rushdie would use Hindustani words and Urdu words and Hindi words and simply not give you a translation. And that is, you and I have read the daffodil poem for the last 150 years, right, in this country. And we have not been given any great help by the English people in finding out what on earth this terrible flower is all about. I can assure you it's a terribly dirty looking flower, but 10,000 saw at a glance and all that. So here is Rushdie turning the tables and saying, well, you've given us trouble, now I'm going to give you trouble. You make out your, whatever you want from this novel. Of course, that's only a part of the story. What I'm trying to drive at is that here is a novel which is about postmodern India. It's about the defeat of India's ideas of nationhood. It is about the decline of Nehruvian India, and it's about a postmodern way of looking at history. And this is what Rushdie does by having a character called Salim Sinai, who is the protagonist of his novel. And he is born exactly at the stroke of midnight. When the clocks did a namaste, right, at 12, Salim Sinai was born and India became independent. So here is a passage, the opening passage, opening paragraph of Midnight's Children, which almost seems to suggest that India's history and Salim Sinai's history are intertwined. What happens to Salim Sinai happens to India, and what happens to India has an impact on Salim Sinai. So the public and the private, the personal and the political merge. And when that happens, you have true historical writing. Because as the great Belgian thinker George Lukács pointed out, in a great historical novel like The Heart of Midlothian by Walter Scott, you must have this merging of the personal and the political, the public and the private, each interpenetrating, each in a symbiotic relationship with the other. That is Lukács' view, and I think you can see it happening in Salman Rushdie's family saga novel called Midnight's Children. Apart from that, there is experimental verve, there is a lot of play with language, there's linguistic brilliance, and I think Rushdie managed to write probably one of the most interesting novels of our times. But more important than having written that novel is what happened to other people because of Rushdie. Because Rushdie's example of 1980 became such an international matter, because he got the Booker Award, later on he's won the Booker of Bookers for the same novel, and so on. A large number of Indian writers in English began writing novels of a similar kind. You can see Alan Seeley in Trottanama, or Mukul Keshavan in Looking Through Glass, Boman Desai on the Memory of Elephants. These are all family saga novels. What is a family saga? You must have heard of Galsworthy's Forsyte Saga. It's about the history of a family over 3, 4, 5 generations. And the writer tries to show you how social developments are in a way implicated in the activities of the individual families. In Trottanama, we have 7 generations of the Trotter family, and they are Anglo-Indians. Midnight's Children then is, I think, a very important turning point in Indian fiction in English. And Rushdie in 1980 created conditions for the efflorescence of Indian writing in English. Those 20 years from 1980 to 2000, I think saw the production of so many novels written by Indians that we have lost count of them. Everybody seems to be writing a novel now, and some of them are really good, and they've become international bestsellers. Arundhati Roy, for example, won the Booker Award in 1996, and more recently, as you know, Kiran Desai has won something called the Booker for the Inheritance of Loss, and more recently, last year, we had Adiga winning the Booker for the White Tiger. And I think what is important in this situation is that we must recognize 2 or 3 important facts. One, that writing in English is no longer a guilt trip. There was a time when people used to feel, will my writing in English have some bad impact on society? Will my writing in English mean that I am not really conveying Indian reality to the general public? Will writing in English automatically compromise me as a person of integrity? My own feeling is that English has now become an Indian language. In fact, Rushdie, I think, taking his cue from this idea, the popularity of his expression chutnification, went on to say that the most significant writing coming out from India is writing in English by Indians. That was an astounding comment. And someone said that it's a combination not only of ignorance, but also arrogance. Rushdie making such a remark, because we all know that wonderful writing is going on in Punjabi and Bengali and Telugu and Tamil and every year we come across writers who win the Sahitya Academy Award or the Jnanapith Award for extraordinary work done in the various Indian languages. And surely, when some people write in English and they make it their own, there is no particular reason why we should think that writing in English automatically means the destruction of an Indian identity.